Hello and welcome back to the Nginx Mastery Series. My name is Xander. In this tutorial, we're going to be taking a look at serving static content. If you have missed any of the tutorials before this one, then you can go ahead and access all the tutorials from the main channel. Go ahead and look for the playlists, and you're looking for Nginx Mastery playlist. This is the third tutorial in this series. If you have missed the first two, then these are introductory tutorials. So it's well worth going back and watching the first one and then moving back over to this tutorial at a later point. However, if you're only interested in this tutorial, no problem. All the code is in the video description and you can follow along. So in the first tutorial, we took a look at utilizing Nginx with Docker, and we will continue utilizing Docker. So if you haven't got Docker Desktop, go ahead onto Google and download Docker Desktop and get that ready. In the second tutorial, we looked at what's happening behind the scenes with Nginx. So now we're ready to start thinking about configuring Nginx to perform some sort of action. And in this tutorial, we're going to set things up further by configuring or having a look at configuring Nginx with multiple domains. So one of the issues when working or practicing utilizing Nginx is once you start needing domain names, that's when we can come into some problems, because potentially you don't actually own any domain names. So when you're trying to configure your configuration files, it can make it difficult to set up your domain name locally. And you end up potentially having to deploy to a server, buying a domain name and setting up all the DNS and so on. So what we're going to try and do in this tutorial is get things started so that we can work locally with Nginx. So in order for us to serve multiple domain names, we're going to need some domain names. Now, normally, like I said, you'd purchase domain names, but what we're going to do here is we're going to configure a lightweight local DNS server in a new container. And that's going to act as a DNS server as if it was on the internet, but locally. And that's going to allow us to configure our Nginx server with domain names. Having a local DNS server can be quite handy when you're developing in certain situations. So this doesn't necessarily just correlate to working with, say, Python, if you're working with PHP or JavaScript frameworks and so on. So this can be a fairly useful thing to have. So it is going to be really lightweight. It's around about 24 meg, the setup. So it's quite simple to set up. Now, I am using a Mac machine here, so I will be giving you instructions for using a Mac. You should be able to translate that into Windows quite easily, and I will give you guidance on what to look for there. But overall, this is a Mac tutorial, and there will be just one or two slight changes that you'll need to make if you're running Windows. So there is a little bit of a setup here. It won't take too long. There is a link in a video description that would take you to the Nginx Mastery Series Part 2. What you need to do is just download this and open it up in Visual Studio Code. So you don't have to use Visual Studio Code, of course, but if you want to follow along step by step, and we are going to be utilizing some extensions, interacting with Docker, so it can be handy utilizing Visual Studio Code for this tutorial. So once you've downloaded that code and opened it up with Visual Studio Code, you'll find that there's going to be a folder and two files. So first of all, we're just going to tidy this up a bit and prepare it slightly differently so that we can work with Nginx and create a DNS server. So first of all, we're going to create a new folder called Nginx, and we're just going to place everything related to Nginx inside of that. So here what we have is the HTML default kind of location, if you like, or folder where we serve static web pages from Nginx. So we're just going to move that over to this folder here, the Nginx folder. So put that in there. And inside of this folder, I'm going to create a new folder called main, because I'm going to have multiple domain names eventually. So I'm going to have multiple domain names. That's going to serve multiple websites. So I'm going to need multiple folders. So inside of the HTML folder here, we've got a main folder for the main domain. And I'm just going to drag the index page into that folder there. So we now have, although it's not very clear, we have a folder here called main. And inside of that, we have the index file. So that's just a simple HTML template there, which is going to serve a simple HTML page just to replicate a website that we might want to serve. So next up, we're going to make a few changes then. So go into the Docker Compose file from here. There's a few changes that we're going to need to make. Let's just go in the Docker file first. Let's sort this out first. So we're going to potentially copy this file over to the to the new image that we're going to build, and that's got a new structure now. So let's just go ahead and get rid of that. So we're just going to serve the HTML folder and everything inside of it. We're going to copy that over to the new image and then container. So we'll just get rid of that. So that should be absolutely fine now. So we don't need the trailing slash in actual fact. Okay, so that just tidies up this Docker file. Now we are going to move this Docker file now inside of our Nginx folder. So I'm just going to drag that over the Nginx folder there. So that should now drop into the Nginx folder. So that's now been placed there. And of course, now we need to just update this context here. So it loads the Docker file inside of our Nginx folder. Right, so that's now nicely connected up. So everything at this point should probably work absolutely fine. Yeah, so let's go ahead and actually build this. So assuming now you've got Docker installed, let's make sure you've got Docker installed. Just double check you haven't got anything open, etc. Okay, so I've got a few things here. Let me just get rid of some of these things here. Well, no, I can't do that because I need to get rid of the container. So I've already downloaded the Nginx default or the Nginx image from the Docker hub, and that's the official image. But if you haven't got it, it's okay. It's going to download in a second. You can see it can be quite large, so it might take a few seconds to download in a second. So that's all now ready. So let's go ahead and just check to make sure everything is working okay. So we're going to do that by running docker compose and then build. That's going to build a new build. Again, build. And that's going to build a new image. So what's going to happen now, we're going to read this here. It reads the context. It's then going to read this file here. It's going to download Nginx, which we do already have a latest image. And then it's going to make some changes to that image. And then that's the image then created. So now we can then go ahead and run that. Now, if you do have, or if you don't have the Docker extension installed, I'm using the Docker extension here in Visual Studio Code. So go to extensions, type in Docker, install it, and then you will then find Docker is, you can then manage Docker from this new icon here. So you can see that we created this new image. That's what we've just created. So let's go ahead and Docker compose up, and then we use the D flag. So that's just going to run behind the scenes there. And you can now see we have this container up and running. Good. Right, so let's test this out. So in the previous tutorial, we've been utilizing port 8000 and localhost. So let's just try this again. And you can see that we have forbidden. Right, so there's probably three things here. The reason why this could be the case, it could just be a general configuration error somewhere, maybe some typo potentially. Secondly, this could be because it cannot find the default page, the index page, and that's probably why it's producing a 403 here. Now, in addition to that, in addition to not having an index page, a default page to serve, it might be that there isn't any files at all. Or it might be looking in the wrong place where there isn't an index page to serve. And this is why we're receiving a 403 forbidden. Now, we could also have issues here with permissions. So it doesn't have permissions to actually run the file. So that could also be a potential issue that you would need to resolve. And obviously it's hard to give you instructions here exactly what that might be. But let's have a look at our configuration and see why this might be forbidden. So running the up command with the D flag, we don't get any of the output from the container, and that can be quite handy in this case. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove this container and just run it again without the D flag in this case. So docker compose up and then without the D flag, and you can see that we get a little bit more information here. So I'm just going to run this again, refresh, and this time we've got some information. So it looks like here it's looking for the directory for some sort of file, user share nginx and then /1. So we've got a host of localhost 8000. So maybe we're just using the wrong port, or maybe not. So let's have a look in the files again. So we are working on port 8000. Okay, that's absolutely fine. And let's just see, we've got the volume here. /HTML, so we're trying to copy this volume over, and notice here, this is the issue, right? So the volume that we're copying across over to our container, or mirroring across to our container, is this folder here, and it's completely empty. So in actual fact, we need to update this to tell Docker that our HTML folder now is in the Nginx folder and then HTML. Okay, so I can get rid of this folder now here. And then hopefully what I can do, utilizing the Docker extension here, I right click and I open up a new shell here like you just saw, and then I can probably pass a new command. So let's go for Nginx, and then we're going to pass a reload command over, and then we're going to refresh. And this time we got a 404 not found. Okay, so we're getting closer. So let's go back into the shell here and see what's happening. So this time, it looks like we're getting closer. So localhost request, localhost 8000. So we've still got potentially an error here. No such directory found. So you can see what's happening here. We're looking in user share Nginx HTML, and then we're looking for the index page. We're not actually looking in the main page. So it's kind of looking in the wrong place at the moment. So we're going to need to create some new configurations for that. Now at the moment, what's happening here is the default configuration can be found. So if we go into the Docker, if you've got the Docker extension, I can go into the files here of my container. We can have a look at the configuration files, and you're going to find those in etc. and then Nginx, and then inside of here the conf.d. And this is the default setting. So I can open this up, and you can see what's happening here is that the root location is the HTML folder, but that's not what we want. We want it to look into main, the new main folder. So this is an important file that we're going to be working with in this tutorial. So it's probably better for us to actually mirror this across using a volume over to our machine so we can work with it directly rather than having to keep going into this folder directory here. So let's just make that change. So we've made the change here to main. So it looks in the main folder, not the HTML folder. So let's go back into our shell and just run the reload command again. Apologies if I'm going too quick here. I was assuming that you've followed the last two tutorials, so you have like a general idea of what we're looking at. So I reloaded everything. So if I refresh now, you can see we've still got the same issue. Go back. So still no such file or directory. We still have that error. So we're looking, okay. Okay, so we've got main here. So not to worry, what we're going to do then is we're just going to create a volume and copy this across over to our machine. So let's just do that first, and we can then sort out everything in a while. So let's go ahead and just shut everything down first. And I'll just get rid of the image that we created earlier so that we're starting fresh again. And then we'll get rid of the config file. So the idea is that we want to take that config file and we want to make it available here in this folder so we can easily access it. So what we're going to do first is create a new folder here called conf.d. So that's the folder name. And then inside of here, we're going to create a new file. It's going to be called default. Now what we could have done was just copy and paste the original file that we just saw over, but we're going to start from scratch, and I'll just go and take you through this step by step so you have a better understanding of what you're doing inside of this file. Right, so now we have that folder in place. When we build, we'll want to actually kind of make a volume so that that kind of copies over to our container. So let's go back into Compose here. We'll create our second volume. I've just pasted that in just for speed, but you can see what's happening here. We're going to copy Nginx, the folder conf.d, and then we're going to mirror that across to our container, etc. Nginx conf.d. That's where we were. Right, so anything inside of this folder is going to be copied across. At the moment, it's completely blank because we're going to work from scratch here. So with that in place, let's go ahead. I think we're now ready to copy everything over. But before we do that, in actual fact, we're going to start to utilize port 80 Right, so we're going to get rid of port 8000. We're going to stop using port 8000. We're going to use port 80, which is the default port for HTTP internet traffic. So make sure we've changed that too. Right, okay. With that set then, let's now go back into our console here. And then we're going to go ahead and run the same commands we did before. So I'll just press up to bring up the previous commands. Doc and compose build, make a new image, and then up. And we will, up. Okay, so that's that ready. Now, the problem we've got now is that in the container, we've copied across default, which is completely blank. So I just want to take you through the basic steps of configuring a web page, a static web page here in your configuration file. So let's think of this file as the work that we want Nginx to perform. So we're going to define here the work that we want Nginx to actually perform. So one thing that we can do here is define a server block. And this is basically a way of telling Nginx that we want it to basically listen, or we're going to define or describe the fact we want it to listen for a port. And then when it finds requests on that port, it's going to perform some sort of action. So we know that internet traffic typically utilizes port 80. So we're going to ask Nginx to listen on port 80 for any kind of incoming requests. Now you might see in the original config file to listen just described, and it looks a little bit like this. And what this is basically an IP version 6 setup. So if you are utilizing IP version 6, just check out the documentation and utilize that. So we are using IP version 4 here. So we're just going to describe listen and then port 80. Right. Second thing we have is the server name. So this is going to allow us to set up multiple domain names. So notice that this server will be running from one IP address. So we're going to send all data to this one IP address. So imagine we have multiple domains. We're going to send, for example, domain1.com to this IP address and then domain2 to this IP address. Well, that's okay, but how does the server know what files to serve, correlating to the domain name that the user's requested? Well, this is where we can use server name. So if we have, for example, a domain called d.com, then anything related to d.com that's been requested is going to be served from this code block here. And what we can do is we can set up a separate domain, maybe e.com, and everything that's been described in here will be served from this server block here. So this is going to allow us to differentiate different settings and configurations for different domains. And we'll have a look at that later. We'll just get this started to begin with. So we're just going to use localhost to begin with. And now we can start to think about the location. So location, right? So location here is going to allow us just to define, for example, the root directory for our website where we're going to serve the static pages. So we know it's in user share, Nginx, and then HTML. We've made a new folder called main. So that's where we want to serve it from. Don't forget your semicolons there to end the statement. So that's that in place. And then we can describe what page we want to load first. So like the default page to load, because the user doesn't normally type in the page. You normally just type in google.com or BBC or amazon.com. You don't actually describe what page you want open first. And that's where this comes in. So our default page is just going to be called index.html. And you can add as many as you like. I'm just going to add one because I know that I'm using index.html. So in the default settings, you'll probably also see the error pages set up. So you can also set up multiple error pages. It's out of the scope of this tutorial. I'm just going to keep it nice and simple for now and just set this up and get it running. But here what we've done is we've defined or we've asked the server to listen for port 80. If it receives a message from port 80 and it matches the server name, then essentially we're going to serve this location. And in this location, we're looking for a file called index.html, and we're going to serve that back to the user. Okay, so now we have a configuration file. Our server is running. So let's just, is it running? No, it's not running. So let's go ahead, it is running, sorry. Let's go ahead and attach a shell so that we can go ahead and reload with this new configuration. So from here, I'm going to type in Nginx and then do a reload. Okay, so let's just see if that has any effect. It doesn't seem to have any effect at all. Okay, so let's just go ahead and shut this down. Because we've made quite a few changes, sometimes it can just be more effective to start from scratch again. So I'm going to do exactly that. Okay, especially when you're starting to begin with this technology, sometimes there can be cache and all sorts happening. So it can be better to start from scratch. So let's go ahead now and start a new container again, and it takes a couple of seconds. We're going to build a new container, and then we're going to bring the container up, and then we're going to give that a go. So now we're going to refresh, and you can see that Safari cannot connect to the server. So if we go back into Docker here, the server is up, so it looks like it's running okay, but potentially we've got some errors that we need to resolve. One thing that we did change was the port number, so we need to be careful of that. So here, localhost 8000 is no longer what we need. We can just use the default localhost. Now it will default to 80, that is the default port, so we don't actually need to type in the port 80. So we press enter, and there we go. So that's the HTML page that is now being served to the user. So now we've got everything up and running. Eventually, you're going to want to map across your domain name to the server. Now, typically that includes you having to purchase a domain name, and then you set up the DNS, and then you go ahead and point that to your server online, and then you install this onto your server, and then that goes ahead and serves your website. Now, the problem here is that we're just experimenting, we're just learning Nginx. So we don't want to go to the expense of buying a domain and then setting up a server online and then keep uploading new configurations and so on. We want to still work locally. So one of the hurdles of actually having this type of setup locally is that the domain name is being resolved by a DNS server online. So that would mean potentially if we wanted to run this locally, we would need to point the DNS server over to our IP address, our local machine here, and then we would need to go to our router, configure port forwarding, so it port forwards over to this machine that we're working on, and then it could potentially work. But again, that's quite a big faff. So what we're going to do in this tutorial is set up a DNS server, a local DNS server, and that's going to resolve domain names for us locally. Ultimately, that means that we can use any domain we want and then go ahead and continue configuring our Nginx server as if it is configured for online use. And potentially what we can then do is make an easier step of integrating that onto our live server online later on. So let's just go for a quick refresher for anyone who's forgotten the general concepts of a DNS server and how that works within this browser internet web page setup. Right, so this is our machine here, depicted in this rectangle here, and inside of our machine we have a browser. Now normally our computer is set up with an IP address, but in addition to that is also set up with a DNS address, and that's normally then provided by your internet service provider, so that gets configured straight away on your computer. Right, so what happens is you type in amazon.com. So the internet cannot route names. So it doesn't know anything about names. The routers and switches in the internet that passes your packets and data forward through the internet over to other resources, it cannot read names. It can only read and understand IP addresses. So what needs to happen when you type in amazon.com, a message needs to be sent across to the DNS server. Now, your DNS server, like I said, has already been hard-coded or is already been configured in your computer. So a signal is sent to that address and then goes online and goes to the DNS server. So 8888, it just happens to be one of Google's DNS servers that you can configure your computer with. So that goes over to the DNS server, and the role of the DNS server is basically just to, one of the roles is to essentially translate the name that you've selected over to an IP address. And what gets sent back from the DNS server is an IP address. So bam, we now have the IP address of the resource that we want to access, and that's amazon.com. So now we have that, we can now go ahead and send a new message out directly to the server with the corresponding IP address. So that goes over to the server. That might be running an Nginx server. And then from there, Nginx can then, like we saw previously, it can then select the resources, the web page, and then send it back to the user. So that's kind of a general workflow of when you try and access a web page. So what we're essentially doing in this tutorial is we are essentially just going to put everything inside of our development environment. So we're going to be working with an Nginx container, and now we're going to set up a DNS server container. And that's basically going to serve or translate domains that we select in our browser over to the IP address of our Nginx server on our local network here. So in actual fact, all these IP addresses are going to be the same. We're just going to be utilizing the local IP address, local loopback address 127.0.0.1. So we're going to set up two domains. So the first domain is going to be called ns.main.com. So we're going to configure that shortly in our DNS server. And then we're going to also then just configure a second domain, and you can call it whatever you like. It's very simple to change, secondary.com. So we're going to set up two domains in our DNS server. And the DNS server is going to be accessed by 127.0.0.1. And then our Nginx server, like we've already seen, that's already configured on the local loopback address. Okay, so we're all using the same IP address here. So essentially what's going to happen in our browser, we're going to type in ns.main.com. It's going to send a signal to our local DNS server, and then we then get the IP address back, and then we can then go ahead and make a request to our Nginx server and access that resource. So like I said, there's going to be two domain names. So we're going to set up two domains in our configuration file, and that's going to be pointed to different files, to different web pages. So that's the setup that we're going to now try and create. So the next step is to then configure our DNS server. So like I alluded to earlier, here I'm using a Mac, and it's going to be slightly different on Windows. So where this is going to differentiate from Mac to Windows is that, like I said, the DNS address is already set in your machine. So we just need to override that with our new DNS settings, which is going to be the loopback address. So there may be some differences in how I do it here than if you're doing it in Windows, but in essence, it's exactly the same. You just need to find the network settings and add in the new DNS address. Now that might also conflict with other systems because we're going to be utilizing a local DNS server. If you were to then use another service, then obviously it's going to try and use that. And of course, if you're going to other web pages, then that won't work, of course, because our DNS server isn't serving those web pages. It's only serving us on the domains that we're setting up. So we'll get to that when we get to that, but just to give you a pre-warning there. All right, so let's go ahead and create a new folder, and let's just get rid of this folder here. And we're going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call that DNS. And then inside of here, we're going to need a few different things, but let's just prepare the Docker file. So we're going to create a new Docker file inside of here. So we're going to be utilizing Alpine for this. It's nice and lightweight. So from Alpine latest. So this is a kind of a lightweight image that we can utilize. And then what we're going to do is we're going to run apt add. And we're going to run something called bind, and that essentially is the DHCP server. And then we're also going to need to start that up. So we're going to also need OpenRC. Okay, so we run that. So we're going to download this new image. We're going to run this command to install these packages. And then we go ahead and run this. So RC update u and then name. That's essentially going to run our DNS server. So that's pretty much all we need to do there. So to confirm, we're going to download a new image. We're going to install the packages, bind being the DHCP server, and OpenRC being kind of a tool that's going to allow us to run our server. So that's what we're doing here. Once we've done that, let's go now into our Docker Compose file. We're going to need to make some changes here, right? So we're going to need a new service. So this service is going to be called DNS. And inside of it, we're going to need a few different things. So let's define our build. So we're going to say build and the context, say .dns. So that's where we're going to find the Docker file. And then once we've done that, let's just define restart. So this is a service that you always want to restart. So if it does fail, we want to try and make sure it kind of restarts, right? So restart build, sorry, context. And let's bring this back. That's right. So it's going to try and always restart. So ports then. So now we're going to define some ports. So if you've used DHCP before, let's just define port 53. So if you're wondering why we're using this port, or indeed if you're not familiar to ports at all, I mentioned before port 80, then just type it in. So you can see here that port 53, it can run on TCP and UDP, and you can see that's for domain name services. So this is a specific port that automatically sends information on that port, if you like. So this is why we need to map it across to our DNS server. So the computer is going to try and resolve the name automatically, and it's going to send that across and use port 53. So we're going to need to listen out for port 53 in our container so we can capture that request. So that's why we've mapped that across. Now notice that it accepts TCP and UDP, so we can also just kind of define our protocol that we want to use. So 53, 53, and we're going to be using UDP. So we've set that up now, so that should listen out for those requests, if you like. So now we can say volumes, and now we can set up some volumes. So we're going to need to set up two different files. So the first file that we're going to need to set up is going to be called name.configuration. Okay, so inside of here, we're going to define some zones. And zones are essentially containers, if you like. Zones are essentially describing the domain names. So, for example, we're going to have two zones here, one for main.com and one for secondary.com. So for each domain, there's a zone, and then from that, we can essentially bind other instructions and commands. So it's a way of kind of controlling each zone, each domain, if you like. So we have that in place. And then secondly, we're going to need a new folder then called zone. So inside of here, in the zone folder, we're going to have our two zones. Let's go for new file. We're going to have main.com. That's going to be our first kind of zone. And then secondly, new file. We're going to call that secondary.com. So these are our two zones. And again, we're just going to add in information related to being able to translate, in this case, the name into an IP address. So there's going to be loads of information in here, which is going to help perform that translation. So these files are going to be mapped across to the container so that we can work locally again. This is why we're going to set this up now in our Docker Compose file, the volumes. So let's just go back in here and do exactly that. So let's map this across. So DNS / and then we start with the name configuration, name.config. So that needs to be mapped across to etc. bind name.config. So we're binding that across to an actual file. Apologies. Okay, so this file here is going to be mapped across to this location, this file here on our container, so we can work with it locally. So that's the first thing. And then secondly is going to be DNS zone. And we're going to map that across to etc. bind zone. I think that's correct. Okay, so once that's done, we're going to need a command to stick this all together. So command, so we're going to say named. So this is referring to the name service, the DNS server. We're going to essentially just make sure that it can find everything it needs. So etc. /bind name.configuration. So it now knows where the configuration is. Remember, we're going to set the configuration up here. This is a configuration right here. We're going to map that across to our container. And then here we're saying basically run the service. And this is the configuration file that we want to run. Okay. So with that in place, I think we're closer to where we need to get to. Right, so next up then, let's start configuring our service. So we'll start with named, I guess. So let's go back into our file called name.config. Right, so a few things here we need to do. We need to set up some zones, like I said. So zone, this is going to be main.com zone. And then we're going to say in. So type is going to be a master. Now there's a whole heap of things here. So this is just kind of a baseline here, right? So file, and I'm just going to point to the file that we're going to create with all the other settings. So etc. bind zone main.com. Okay, so that's referring to the file here main.com, right? Or the information about main.com. So that's our first zone. So with that in place, let's go ahead now and go to main.com, and let's now talk a little bit about setting out our DNS service for main.com. So this can be known as the DNS resource record. This is going to describe the characteristics of our zone. We know that we've got this zone here, main.com, and we pointed it to this file. So this file here is essentially just describing the characteristics of our zone. Resource records can have different representations, different formats. Here we're just going to try and make it as clear and simple as possible for you to understand. So typically what you might find at the top is a TTL, time to live, and that is basically a 32-bit value indicating how long the RR may be cached, or cached. So TTL. So let's just set this up for 86400. So here this is seconds, so I'm defining 86,400 seconds. So now we can configure our resource types. So the first type we're going to set up is, I think it's SOA, yep. So start of authority. So we have it at, and then essentially we have the class in, and then SOA. So a few things here that we need to set up. So this basically defines a few things. The zone name, ns.main.com. So that's our domain name, right? So you can call that whatever you like. I've just decided on that. And then we can also define the email address. So hostmaster.main.com. And so don't forget the trailing dot on both. Okay, so notice we don't need the at here. The format here is using dots because the at symbol represents something else. So that pretty much sets up that. And there are a range of different configurations here that we can define in our SOA. So for example, let's go for in seconds 201, and then this will describe the kind of serial. The serial does play an important role. It's kind of out of the scope of this tutorial, and we don't necessarily need to know this, but a zone serial number is a version number for the SOA record, right? So for example, when the serial number changes in the zone file, this essentially will alert secondary name servers, and that should then update their copies of the zone file. So it plays an important part. So other parameters, for example, the second here, 600, say. So this here will be the refresh. And notice I'm using the semicolon. That represents a comment in this case. So the rest of the line will be commented out. So this is a refresh. So this is essentially describing the length of time, again, in seconds. The secondary server should wait before asking this primary server for the SOA record to see if there's been any updates. And then it kind of continues. What we've got now is the retry. Right, so retry again, the length of time. Again, I think that's the server should wait for asking an unresponsive primary name server for an update again. and then we've got expiry, which is probably going to be normally a little bit longer. Okay, so that's if a secondary server does not get a response from the primary server for this amount of time, it should stop responding to queries for the zone. There's also, I think, a negative cache TTL, but let's just finish there. So we'll just finish that right there. So be careful where you put the ending parenthesis. So that's that in place. So let's move on. So we can go ahead and specify a name server, which essentially just defines the authoritative name server for the domain, defined in our SOA record here. So let's go ahead and do that. So at, that's going to be in, and this time we're going to describe NS, so our name server, and that's going to be ns.name.com. Okay. So last of all, then we're going to need an A record. Okay, so we are using IP version 4 here. So if we were using IP version 6, we would use a 4 A's. So an A record then, basically an IP address for the host. So we just need to describe an IP address for the host, which is going to be the loopback address. And there we go. So essentially what we're saying here is that if we get a request for ns.main.com, then what we need to do is return the IP address. So this is the IP address of nsmain.com. So that's pretty much it, really. We've just described our IP, our domain name, how to contact the administrator for that domain, and then where that actual kind of domain should be ended. In this case, the loopback address. So at this point, we can now go back into our Nginx folder, look for the conf file or the default configuration file. We need to just change the server name, because remember now what we're using is ns.main.com. So that's going to be our domain name. So let's just make sure we make a change there. Just before we load things up, I was just double checking all the files. I went into the name.config file here and noticed that I forgot the trailing semicolon. So let's not forget that. So that was in the DNS name configuration file. And while we're looking at this, we're also going to need the semicolon at the end here as well. Just taking a look at the main.com file, just to double check this, I noticed I typed in name here and not main. So that's another change that I need to make. So main. And then finally, I will put some links in the video description so you can have a read yourself, but we're going to add some options. So if you go into the DNS named configuration, we just need to add some options here. So let's get that done. So options, and then we first of all, let's go ahead and just select the directory. So basically, we're just defining the absolute path for the server here, right? So directory, and that's going to be var/bind. Okay. So that's going to make sure that everything is using this kind of base directory. Some other options of interest, for example, allowed transfer. So here you can define, for example, IP addresses are allowed to transfer or copy the zone information from the server. So the default behavior is allow zone transfer to any host. So what we can do is we can say allow transfer. We want to turn that off. So let's go for none. So we don't want any kind of domain transfer. So we need to be careful here of the format. So we're going to need semicolon and then a semicolon afterwards. We can also, for example, utilize allow query. So this is basically going to define or match IP addresses which are allowed to issue queries to the server. So we can just set that as any. There we go. So in addition, we can also, for example, change the port that we're going to listen on. So we're not going to do that. So let's just say we're going to listen on any port. So again here, this allows us to define the port or IP addresses on which the bind will listen for incoming queries. Obviously, the default port, as we learned, is port 53 on all server interfaces. So we don't need to actually add anything there because the default port is 53 and we're using port 53. But that's something that you might want to configure. Okay, so before we build, again, just make sure that we utilize all the semicolons in the right place. So at the end here, and yeah, just make sure you've lined everything up if you're following it step by step. So we're now ready to go ahead and build again. So just make sure that you stop any of the containers. I've got rid of all the images. So we're just going to go for a build again. So let's give this a go. So compose build and then up. There we go. Okay. So it looks like everything is working okay. So we can double check. So two things we can do. We can use an NS lookup and then type in our domain, ns.main.com. And you can see that is being resolved, the address 127.0.0.1. So that's utilizing our DNS server to resolve that. In addition to that, we can also utilize dig. So we can say dig and then at 127.0.0.1 and then ns.main.com. That's going to give us a little bit more information, but you can see we have an answer section here, which is suggesting that we get an answer from our DNS server and we resolved that at this IP address. So everything looks absolutely fine. So this is where it's going to be slightly different. Again, Windows, Mac, right? So if I were to go to the web page and try it out, it's not going to work. It's not happening. Nothing is happening here. So one thing that we're probably going to need to do here is to configure the network, right? So on my machine, I go ahead and select the wireless icon and go to network preferences, and I can't drag that down. But one second. Inside of here, we've got a few different options. So you start here, we can go over to DNS. And what we can do here in the Mac is we can just define our DNS settings. So you can see I've got two here. I've got the server, our DNS server, and then we've got the Google DNS server. So I'm just going to get rid of that and make sure that I've only got our own DNS server. Press OK and apply, and now that should be ready. So if we go back into the browser and try, you can see it's not resolving. There's a few issues. So let's go back to our settings here. Let's go into the Nginx file. Let's go to the default config file, and let's have a look at the server name. So here we can define a few different patterns. So for example, let's define main.com, nsmain.com, and then we can also use, for example, the star wildcard, anything basically .main.com. So let's try that out. So I'll go back into my Nginx server. I'm just going to attach a shell and restart that. Why it does that? Let's do that again. So let's go for Nginx. And then let's go for a reload. So let's just see if that has worked. So we'll refresh. You can see we still got some issues. So the important bit here is that when you try and complete a lookup, and then when you try and do dig, for example, you do get a response. So it's clearly it is resolving. So clearly our DNS server is working okay. So in this case, it's indicating that there potentially is a problem with our browser. So I do have Chrome installed. So let's just open up Chrome and just give it a go here, ns.test.com. Oh, sorry, ns.main.com. And you can see that it looks like potentially it's going to work. And potentially there's kind of a cache issue here. It's a difficult one to say. Potentially if I reopen Safari, everything will work okay. But let's just double check to see if this isn't cached and that is actually working as intended. So what we can do is if we go into the HTML index file here, let's just add something onto the end there. So to indicate the fact that we've made a change. Now that should instantly make a change. So let's go back into Chrome and then refresh. So clearly the web page is being served. So we have met our objectives or objective at the moment, but it looks like Safari is having a problem. So I'm just going to restart Safari. Give this a go again. So ns.main.com. and it still has a problem. So just going back to my network configuration again, I can see that I still have the old DNS record, and I think this is what the problem is. So for some reason, when we have dual DNS servers, it doesn't actually use the first one. It seems to skip with Safari to the second, which is the Google DNS server. So I'll just try it again and press apply. So I definitely have changed it there. I'm going to close that to make sure. And then when I go back to Safari, you can see now it's actually working in Safari. So you can kind of see the quirky bits here that potentially you're going to have with this. Now, this can be set up. So let's not forget that I've only have one DNS server set up at the moment. So let's just go for amazon.com. And you can see that it does work okay. So potentially it isn't going to affect the system in terms of using other DNS services on your network. It should work in hand, but you will find that some things won't work. For example, if you try and run Docker with that kind of global DNS, I think Docker will try to utilize your loopback and it won't use any other DNS server. So when you are trying to do things like apt update or apt-get install, you're going to have issues and you're going to need to put that other DNS server back in. Now on Windows, I'm not entirely sure, but in Windows, what you're going to need to do is go into the network settings and configure your DNS server, similar to what we've done here, but utilizing the Windows systems. If you can't get Windows to work, I mean, as long as you do, like I said before, as long as you've got the NS lookup working, what you can do is a curl, again, probably not on Windows directly, you can curl to it and return back the web page. So ns, what we called ns.main.com, and you can see that will return the web page. So that's something else you can do just to confirm that everything is working okay. So at that point, it's just going to be a browser or your DNS setting issue. So I probably am expecting some comments here. I can't get it working and so on, and I do apologize. You can see that it is working here, and it's going to be a case of just following the code or just making sure that you've set up your DNS correctly. Now, one other thing that will throw this off if you're using Mac is if you're using the new Mac service, the private relay service. So what you're going to need to do is go to a system preference, go to your ID and turn off that relay, because this won't work otherwise. Okay, so that's another thing that you'll need to turn off if you're using Mac and you're using that new relay system. So otherwise it should work okay. So now we've got one. Let's see if we can work out how to now add a second domain. Okay, so this should be really simple in actual fact, adding a second domain. So let's start off with Nginx. We're just going to need to create a new folder in our HTML folder here. So we're going to call this secondary. Secondary. And then inside of here, we're just going to copy this index page here. And we're going to call this hello from, and we're going to say secondary. Okay, so now we know that's going to be the secondary page or secondary website we're going to serve. Let's go into our conf D default configuration. So let's just copy this down. Port 80. So here we're going to use secondary.com, ns.secondary.com, secondary.com. So you can call whatever you like, of course. Now we need to be careful here. We're now not using main folder. We're using the secondary folder. So replace that too. Otherwise, everything is exactly the same there. So that's now that configured. Now we go into the name config of the DNS server. So let's add a new zone. So we're going to call this secondary.com. That's going to be the name. Okay, so that's the file. So we're going to need to make a file. We've already made the file here. So let's just copy this from the main to the secondary, and let's just change this. So secondary. Now it's well worth giving it a go. Type in google.com. See if you can get google.com working. It should be working okay. Secondary.com, because it's trying to be served from your local DNS first. So secondary.com. So just change the name main to secondary. So the IP address is going to be the same again. So that's that configured. Yeah, so we've done this, so you can see that what's going to happen here, although we're using the same IP address, like I said earlier, it's going to be utilizing the server name to determine whether to serve this page or this this index page here. So either this folder or this folder's index page based upon the server name. Okay, so with that in place, I think we've done the name.config in the DNS. We've set up our secondary.com zone configuration. Yeah, I think we're ready to go. So let's go ahead and just start from scratch again. So we'll just get rid of that, and then we'll just get rid of the images. So let's go back and let's go ahead and run docker build. Just wish I kind of, there we go, build. There we go. So we'll build that, and that should take a couple of seconds, and then we should be able to just put that up, and then hopefully we've then got 2 domains. Okay, so if you are working on a Mac, what you're going to find now, like I said earlier, and this is just a proof of what I said, what we're trying to do here is run our Docker Compose or Docker file in the Nginx. And notice here we're trying to get an app update and install. Now, because we've set the network preferences to utilize our loopback DNS, it's not going to be able to download those resources. So what we're going to need to do, which is a little bit faffy, is we're going to need to just add back in temporarily our DNS server that we want to use. So we can then go ahead and run build again, and then it can go ahead and actually perform these tasks. So notice now that it's working okay. Like I said, there is a way around this on different OSs, but we're going to stick with this just for now. And so once that's done, we're going to go for up, and it looks like everything is okay there. So what we're going to need to do again is just go into our network preferences and just turn that back off. See, it's a bit of a pain, but let's remove that again. Apply. Okay, so let's just test this out. So first of all, let's just go ahead and run NSLookup. So it looks like that's okay, the main. So let's do the same thing for the secondary. .com. So it looks like that is now being resolved too. So there's no reason why it shouldn't work. So let's go into Chrome. Let's type in ns.secondary.com. And there we go. Hello from secondary. So clearly we are now serving 2 websites or 2 domains from Nginx. Okay, and there we go. Hopefully that was of some use to you. There might be a little bit of playing around to get that right for your particular operating system or your needs. But hopefully that gives you a baseline into the world of Nginx serving static content. Of course, there's a load more that we can go through, but I want to just make it short and sweet, to the point, hopefully, and I've given you enough information to start thinking about utilizing it in this way if that's what your if that's what your goal is. And if it isn't, then this is just good practice to start to understand the basic of configuring a static web server. Again, I hope the idea of utilizing a local DNS server has whet your appetite. I think we're going to keep moving this forward so we can really start to build everything locally, so that when we go ahead and deploy it on our server, there should be very minimum amount of actual changes that we need to make. So that just leaves me to say thank you to the channel members for your continual support, supporting the channel. If you are thinking about supporting the channel further, you can do by clicking on the channel membership or following us on Patreon. Of course, if you're not aware of all the socials that we're on, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and Discord. So thank you very much for listening. Hopefully you got this far. If you have, again, thank you very much, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial.